You have until noon tomorrow, Roy Mercer said. After that, I'm calling the custom crew, and they're cutting every stalk whether you like it or not. He said it from the far end of the kitchen table, still wearing the canvas coat he had come home in. Dust had dried white around the cuffs. His right hand was wrapped around a coffee mug, but he wasn't drinking. He was holding it the way a man holds something when he needs both hands occupied. Across from him, 20-year-old Lena Mercer kept her eyes on the unpaid bills spread beside her plate. The biggest one was from the hospital in Amarillo. The second biggest was from the bank. Outside the kitchen window, 56 acres of grain sorghum stood dark red beneath a pale December sky. The heads bent slightly in the wind, heavy with grain. Every other sorghum field along County Road 14 had been cut weeks ago. Only the Mercer field remained. The neighbors called it Milo, like nearly everyone did in that part of the Oklahoma Panhandle, and for the past month, people had been slowing down as they drove past it. Some looked curious. Most shook their heads. A few had already decided Lena had no idea what she was doing. "You're watching good grain lose value every day," Roy said. "Birds are eating it, wind's working on it. One wet storm and it'll be flat on the ground." Lena looked through the window at the red field. "Not yet." Roy's jaw tightened. "That's what you said 2 weeks ago." "I know." "And last week?" "I know. Your grandfather built this place by harvesting crops, not admiring them." Lena looked back at the bills. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to slide the yellow notebook across the table and show him the figures she had written on 3 separate pages. She wanted to explain why cutting the sorghum might be the fastest way to lose the cattle, the field, and maybe the whole farm. But Roy had spent 48 years believing that a crop left standing after harvest season was a crop being wasted. And he had spent the last 6 months learning what it felt like to need help getting out of a chair. Lena could not bring herself to say, "I'm doing this because your heart surgery drained the operating account, and because you can't work the way you used to." So she said the smallest thing she could. "Give me 7 more days." Roy pushed the coffee away. "You don't have 7 days. What neither of them knew was that the weather radio sitting on the counter would issue a winter storm warning before midnight. What Roy did not know was that Lena had already made a second plan in case the sorghum went down. And what Lena did not know was that by the end of that week, she would be standing in the middle of that field, convinced her decision had poisoned the very cattle she was trying to save. 6 months earlier, Lena had not been running the Mercer place. She had been taking agricultural business classes at a community college 70 miles away, working 3 evenings a week at a feed store, and coming home most weekends to help. Roy handled the farming. Lena handled whatever he handed her. Then, in late May, Roy collapsed beside the seed tender. 1 minute he was arguing with a hydraulic hose. The next minute he was sitting on the ground with both hands pressed against his chest, trying to convince Lena he had only pulled a muscle. He had not pulled a muscle. The helicopter ride, the procedure, the hospital stay, and the weeks of follow-up care changed the farm faster than any drought ever had. Roy survived. But the man who came home was not the same man who had climbed into the ambulance. He tired quickly. His hands sometimes shook. Walking from the house to the shop left him short of breath on hot afternoons. He could still tell Lena when a bearing sounded wrong from 50 feet away. He could still look at clouds and guess whether they held rain. He could still manage a farm in his head. He just could not do all the physical work his plans required. So Lena came home. At first, the neighbors praised her. They said she was a good daughter. They said Roy was lucky. They said she had grown up overnight. Then summer settled in. Rain disappeared. The grass turned silver by July. Stock ponds shrank into muddy circles. Hay fields that normally produce 2 cuttings barely produced one. By August, ranchers were calling 3 counties away looking for bales. By September, the price of hay had nearly doubled. That was when the compliments stopped. It was one thing for a young woman to help her injured father. It was another thing for her to make decisions. Roy wanted to sell 8 cows before winter. Lena wanted to keep the herd together. Roy wanted to harvest the grain sorghum and use the money to buy hay. Lena kept saying the numbers did not work. The argument followed them everywhere. It lived in the pickup. It waited in the equipment shed. It sat between them at supper. Finally, one evening in October, Roy told her to go through the old office in the north barn and find the maintenance records for the combine header. The office had not been used in years. Dust covered the desk. Mouse droppings filled the bottom drawer. A calendar from 1998 still hung behind the door. Turned to March. Lena found the maintenance records in a metal file box. She also found a yellow spiral notebook beneath them. Her grandmother's name was written inside the front cover. Mabel Mercer. Mabel had died when Lena was 11. Lena remembered flour on her hands, peppermints in her coat pocket, and a voice that could turn a room quiet without ever getting loud. Roy always said Mabel understood cattle better than most men understood themselves. The notebook was not a diary. It was a record of dry years. Mabel had written down rainfall, feed prices, calving percentages, pasture conditions, and the dates of the first killing freezes. She had recorded which cows stayed fat, which fields held moisture, and which decisions cost more than they returned. The further Lena read, the less the pages felt old. One entry was dated November 17, 1976. Hay short. Milo good. No sense paying a man to cut feed, haul it away, and then paying another man to haul feed back. Below that, Mabel had written one sentence twice. Don't pay twice for the same mouthful. Lena sat down in the dusty office. She kept reading. During several dry winters, Mabel and Lena's grandfather had not harvested every acre of mature grain sorghum. They had fenced portions of it and let cattle graze the standing crop in narrow strips. Not all at once. Not carelessly. A little at a time. Mabel had underlined that part. Test stressed plants. Never turn hungry cattle straight in. Wait after a hard frost. Give them only what they can clean up. Keep mineral and dry roughage available. Watch the cows, not the calendar. Lena read those lines until the light outside the office went gray. Then she took the notebook home and started doing the math. If they harvested all 56 acres, the grain would bring in cash. But not as much cash as Roy kept imagining. The custom harvest crew had raised its rate. The grain had to be hauled nearly 40 miles. The local elevator was discounting sorghum with low test weight. Fuel was up. And because the Mercers had sold their older combine the year before Roy's heart attack, they could not harvest the crop themselves. Lena estimated what would remain after cutting, hauling, and the bank's portion. Then she calculated what it would cost to feed 37 cows through a dry winter with hay at current prices. She ran the figures again, then a third time. Harvesting the sorghum would put money into the account. Buying winter feed would take out more. The farm would move backward. The cattle would eat the crop either way. The only question was whether the crop traveled through a combine, a truck, an elevator, another truck, and finally a feed bunk before reaching them. Mabel's idea cut out almost everything in the middle. It was not free feed. Nothing on a farm was free, but the crop was already there. The fence posts were already in the shed. The cattle had legs. The arithmetic was simple enough to scare her. If the plan worked, they could keep the herd and make the winter loan payment. If it failed, the field could be ruined, the cattle could lose condition, and the Mercers would have no money left to correct the mistake. Lena called the county extension office the next morning. She expected the agent to laugh. He did not. He told her the method could work, but sorghum was not something to handle casually. Drought-stressed plants could carry nitrate risk. Fresh regrowth and frost-damaged tissue could create other problems. The field needed sampling, and the cattle needed controlled access. Lena took samples. She sent them to a lab. She waited. The report came back within the acceptable range for the way she intended to use it, provided she managed access carefully and maintained supplemental roughage. That report should have made the decision easy. It did not. Because farming decisions are rarely only about what can work. They are also about what people can stand watching. Roy could not stand watching mature grain remain in the field. By the first week of November, nearly every neighbor had harvested. By the second week, Wade Kessler started stopping by. Wade farmed the property south of the Mercers. He was 53, clean-shaven, and always wore a white pickup cap that looked new, no matter how dusty the road was. He had asked to lease the Mercer ground twice since Roy's surgery. Both times, Roy had refused. The third time Wade asked, Lena was driving steel posts along the edge of the sorghum. He parked on the county road and walked over. "You putting up a fence around a grain crop?" he asked. "That's what it looks like. You know grain doesn't usually run away. Cows do." Wade smiled. "So the rumor's true." Lena kept driving the post. "What rumor?" "That you're turning cattle into this field after the next hard freeze." Wade looked over the sorghum. The red heads moved in the wind like a dark tide. "You get one chance with a crop like this," he said. "You cut it when it's ready." Lena picked up another post. "That's one way. It's the way that pays. Not this year." Wade tilted his head. "Your dad approved this?" Lena drove the post harder than necessary. "We're working it out." "That means no." She did not answer. Wade walked closer to the fence line. "I'm not trying to be unfriendly. Your father's in a hard spot. You're in over your head. It happens. What do you want, Wade?" "I'll lease this field today. Cash up front. I'll get it harvested, and you won't have to gamble your winter on something you read online." "I didn't read it online." "Where'd you read it?" "My grandmother's records." For the first time, Wade laughed. Not loudly. That made it worse. "Well," he said, "I'm sure cattle were different back then." "So was hay. It was affordable." His smile faded. "You lose this crop, my offer drops. Then I guess you'd better hope I don't lose it." Wade looked at her for a moment. "I don't have to hope." He walked back to his truck. By the time Lena finished the fence, she was shaking. That evening, Roy asked who had stopped by. "Wade. What did he want?" "The same thing he always wants." "The same thing he always wants." Roy looked toward the window. "You could do worse than leasing to him." Lena stared at her father. 6 months earlier, he would have thrown Wade off the place for making the offer. Now he sounded tired enough to consider it. That scared her more than the unpaid bills. The first killing freeze came on a Tuesday night. Lena waited. 3 days later, she walked the field with the extension agent. They checked the plants, talked through the risks, and agreed on the starting plan. Lena filled the cattle with hay before turning them in. She set a front fence and a back fence with polywire, opening only a narrow strip. Roy watched from the pickup. He had insisted on coming. "This is a mistake," he said. "Maybe. That's not much of an answer. It's the honest one." Lena opened the temporary gate. The cattle stood at the edge of the field. For one long second, none of them moved. Roy looked at her. Lena felt heat rise up her neck. Then an old black cow named Dot stepped through. The others followed. They moved into the sorghum cautiously, sniffing the dry leaves and heavy seed heads. Dot wrapped her tongue around a bent stalk, pulled the head down, and began eating. Within minutes, the field was alive with the sound of breaking stalks and grain being stripped from heads. Roy said nothing. Lena said nothing. They watched until the sun went down. The next morning, the cattle were waiting at the front wire. Their sides were full. The strip behind them had been picked over cleanly. Lena moved the fence forward. The cattle stepped into fresh sorghum. On the third day, Roy asked how much hay she had fed. About a third of what they were getting. He grunted. On the sixth day, he asked whether any cows had gone off feed. No. On the eighth day, he asked to see the lab report. Lena handed it to him. He read every line. Then he folded it and placed it on the dashboard. That doesn't mean the weather won't take the field. I know. Doesn't mean the cattle won't waste half of it. I know. Doesn't mean this works all winter. I know. Roy looked at her. You say that a lot. Because I know what I don't know. Something in his face changed. Not approval. Not yet. But the argument lost some of its heat. For the next 2 weeks, the plan worked. Lena moved the fence every morning. The cattle cleaned each strip before receiving the next one. She kept hay available, monitored water, checked manure, watched body condition, and wrote everything in Mabel's notebook. Date, temperature, wind, size of strip, hay fed, cattle behavior. At the bottom of each page, she wrote what she would change the next day. Neighbors still slowed down on the road, but fewer of them shook their heads. Then the weather radio issued the warning. The storm was coming from the northwest, dragging freezing rain ahead of a hard Arctic front. Roy heard the report after their argument at supper. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not need to. Lena spent the next morning tightening wire, moving the water tank, and opening a sheltered section near the east windbreak. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned the color of dirty wool. Freezing rain arrived before dark. It coated the sorghum leaves, the fence wire, the pickup mirrors, and the bare cottonwoods around the house. Then the wind came. At 2 in the morning, Lena woke to something striking the side of the house. She pulled on her boots and went outside. The north wind nearly took the door from her hands. She drove toward the sorghum field with the pickup in four-wheel drive, leaning over the steering wheel to see through the ice. The headlights found the first broken posts near the west corner. Then they found the cattle. The back fence had sagged under the ice. The herd had pushed through. Instead of remaining in the narrow strip, 37 cows were spread across nearly 10 acres of standing sorghum. Lena's stomach dropped. She parked, grabbed a flashlight, and ran. The field was slick beneath her boots. Ice cracked from the leaves as she passed. Some cattle were eating. Others were trampling stalks as they moved through the dark. She tried to gather them alone. The wind swallowed her voice. By the time Roy arrived in the tractor, the cattle had reached the next fence. He climbed down slowly. What happened? Back wire came down. How long have they been out? I don't know. Maybe an hour, maybe 3. Roy swept the flashlight across the field. Get 'em out. They worked until almost dawn. Roy used the tractor to block the field road while Lena pushed the herd toward the holding pasture. Twice she slipped and fell. Once a cow turned back and carried 6 others with her. Finally, the last animal passed through the gate. The damage became visible at sunrise. A wide section of the western field lay flattened beneath ice. Stalks had been trampled into the soil. Seed heads rested against the frozen ground. The careful strips were gone. Roy stood beside the pickup, breathing hard. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Lena looked at the cattle. Several were still chewing. One red cow stood apart from the herd with her head low. Lena walked toward her. The cow took 2 steps and stopped. Something was wrong. Lena called the veterinarian. For the next 40 minutes, every terrible possibility ran through her mind. Too much grain. Nitrate poisoning. Something she had missed. Something she had misunderstood. Something the lab report had not captured. The veterinarian arrived as sleet began falling. He examined the red cow while Lena held the gate. Roy waited a few feet away. "How many were in the field?" the veterinarian asked. "All of them." "For how long?" "I don't know." He checked the cow again. Lena could barely force out the question. "Is it the sorghum?" The veterinarian straightened. "No." Lena stared at him. "She's got a piece of wire in the front of her mouth. Probably picked it up near the old feeder." He removed a short length of rusted baling wire lodged beside the cow's teeth. The cow lifted her head almost immediately. Lena's knees went weak. The veterinarian looked from her to the field. "That said, you need to assume those cattle ate more than planned. Keep them off the sorghum today. Feed dry hay. Watch them closely. Call me if anything changes." Lena nodded. Roy paid him. Neither spoke until the veterinarian had driven away. Then Roy looked at the flattened field. "You got lucky." "Yes." "Luck isn't a management plan." "No." "You could have lost the herd." "Yes." Roy waited for her to defend herself. She did not. That seemed to make him angrier. "Say something." Lena looked at the broken fence. "I should have used stronger corner braces." "That's what you've got?" "I should have moved them completely out of the field before the ice came." "You knew the storm was coming." "I thought the wire would hold." "It didn't." "I can see that." Roy stepped closer. "This isn't a class project, Lena. When you get something wrong out here, it doesn't come back with corrections written in the margin." She flinched. Roy saw it, but he was too frightened to stop. "Cut the field," he said. "Whatever's still standing, cut it before we lose everything. The custom crew won't come now. Then call someone else." The field's iced over. "Then call them when it clears." Lena looked at the lodged sorghum. "If it warms up first, the grain on the ground could spoil. That is no longer your decision." He walked toward the pickup. Lena followed him. "Dad, I mean it. You can't just—" "I can. My name is on the deed. My name is on the note. My name is on every bill sitting in that kitchen." He opened the passenger door. "Tomorrow, you call the crew." That night, Lena sat alone in the North Barn office. Mabel's notebook lay open on the desk. Ice tapped against the small window. The storm had knocked out power to half the county, but the barn's old propane heater still worked. Lena sat close enough to feel it on one side of her face. She replayed Roy's words. "My name is on the deed." He was right. The field was his. The debt was his. The risk had been hers only because he had allowed it to be. Lena looked down at the notebook. For the first time since finding it, she wished she had left it beneath the maintenance records. The idea had sounded so clear in Mabel's handwriting. Don't pay twice for the same mouthful. But Mabel had not written what to do when the fence collapsed. She had not written what to say to a father who no longer trusted his daughter. She had not written how to tell whether holding on was courage or just another name for being stubborn. Lena turned the page. Then she turned another. Near the back of the notebook, 2 pages were stuck together. She pulled them apart carefully. The first page contained figures from the winter of 1983. The second held a short entry written in pencil. Ice took the west field. Cattle broke through and made a mess. Cal wanted to harvest what was left. Lena stopped breathing for a moment. She read the next line. Cold behind the storm, saved more than it ruined. Ground froze hard. Lodged heads kept better than expected. Used smaller strips. Back fence every day. Never trust one wire in ice. Lena read it again. Then she saw a note along the margin. After a wreck, count what remains before burying it. She stood up. The heater rattled behind her. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees. The radio forecast said it would fall below zero by morning and remain bitterly cold for at least 6 days. The same cold Lena had feared might do two things. It would freeze the soil solid, reducing trampling and mud, and it could hold the lodged grain in place long enough for her to ration it, provided the cattle could reach it and the feed remained safe. The field was damaged. But damaged was not the same as gone. Lena grabbed a flashlight and drove back out. She walked the eastern half first. Most of it was still standing. Then she crossed into the western section. The ice-covered stalks looked ruined from the road, but up close the damage was uneven. Some heads were pressed into the frozen residue. Others hung 18 inches above the ground. In the area the cattle had entered, there was obvious waste. Beyond it, much of the grain remained. Lena took photos. She marked the worst areas. She measured several sections by pacing them off. Then she went home and spread a field map across the kitchen table. Roy came in just before sunrise. He looked exhausted. "What are you doing?" "Counting what remains. I told you to call the crew." "I will." Roy looked at her sharply. "But first, come see the field in daylight." "No." 10 minutes. We've already been over this. 10 minutes. And if you still want it cut, I'll make the call. Roy stared at her. Lena slid Mabel's notebook toward him. She made the same mistake. He looked down at the page. For a moment, he did not touch it. Then he picked up the notebook. He knew his mother's handwriting immediately. Lena watched his eyes move across the lines. "Mabel never told me about this. She probably didn't want you knowing she'd lost a fence." Roy read the entry again. "The winter of '83, he said quietly. "That was the year Dad's hay barn burned." Lena had never heard that story. "What happened?" "We thought we'd have to sell half the cows." He looked at the field map. "We didn't." "Because of the sorghum?" Roy closed the notebook. "I was 17. I didn't ask where the feed came from. I just did what they told me." He stood there a long time. Then he reached for his coat. "You said 10 minutes." They drove to the field without speaking. The wind had cleared the clouds. Morning light spread over the ice, making every stalk shine. Lena showed him the standing eastern section. Then she showed him the lodged areas. She explained the new plan. Smaller strips. 2-wire front fence. A reinforced back fence moved daily. No access during storms. Feed hay before every move. Use the frozen ground to reach lodged sections without turning the field to mud. Retest representative samples from the damaged areas. Keep the worst section closed until they knew more. Roy listened. What if the test comes back bad? Then that section stays closed. What if the cows waste too much? We shrink the strips. What if another fence goes down? We don't rely on one fence. What if the cold lasts longer than forecast? Then hay gets even more expensive. Roy looked across the field. That wasn't my question. I know. He waited. Lena forced herself to say it. If the plan stops being safe, we stop, even if it means selling cows. Roy nodded once. That was the answer he had needed. Not confidence. A stopping point. By noon, they had taken new samples. By evening, Roy had helped Lena build stronger corners. He could not lift the heavy posts, but he sat on the tractor and directed her with the precision of a man who had built hundreds of fences. Too loose. Lena tightened the wire. Still too loose. It could hold an elk. We don't own elk. Tighten it. She did. For the first time in weeks, they almost laughed. The lab results came back within the management range they needed. The veterinarian reviewed the plan. The extension agent reviewed it too. 3 days after the storm, Lena opened a strip no wider than a long driveway. The cattle entered slowly. They reached under the ice, pulled down the bent heads, and began eating. Lena watched for an hour, then another. The next morning, the strip was clean. Not perfect. No field ever was. But clean enough. She moved the wire. The system began again. A few days later, the Arctic front deepened. Temperatures fell below zero at night. Water tanks froze. Diesel engines refused to start. Roads remained dangerous. The little available hay in the region became harder to move, and every day it stayed cold, the price climbed. Ranchers started feeding bales they had planned to save for February. Then they started feeding the bales they had planned to save for March. Wade Kessler had stored enough hay for a normal winter. This was not a normal winter. A section of his hay barn roof collapsed under ice, ruining part of his supply. 2 truckloads he had purchased from Colorado were delayed by road closures. By the second week of January, Wade began selling cows. So did several other ranchers. The sale barn filled with thin cattle and tired men. Prices dropped because too many animals arrived at once. At the Mercer place, Lena moved the fence every morning. Some days the cattle received a strip of standing sorghum. Other days they worked through a lodged section while the ground was frozen hard. They still received hay, but far less than they would have needed without the field. The sorghum was not a miracle. It required planning. It required testing. It required daily labor in weather that made Lena's fingers ache inside insulated gloves. It required watching the herd closely enough to notice small changes. But it worked. The cattle held their condition. The haystack shrank slowly. The bank account stopped bleeding. At the end of January, Roy drove the pickup along the field while Lena moved the fence. He had started walking farther each week, but the cold still tightened his chest. He parked near the water tank and watched. The cattle waited behind the wire. Lena checked the posts, opened the circuit, moved the reel, and stepped aside. The herd entered the next strip. Red seed heads disappeared beneath black and brown faces. Roy lowered the window. "Your grandmother used to move fence like that," he said. Lena turned. "You remember?" "I remember being mad because she made me roll wire after school." Lena smiled. "She write that down?" "Probably. She wrote down everything I did wrong." Roy looked over the field. "I thought your grandfather came up with this." "So did I." "No, this was her." He nodded toward the cattle. "Your granddad would have cut the whole field and bragged about how fast he did it. Your grandmother was the one who knew when not to start an engine." They watched the cows feed. Roy's voice lowered. "I forgot that." Lena did not know what to say. He cleared his throat. "You didn't. That was all." But it was enough. 2 days later, Wade Kessler pulled into the Mercer yard. His white cap was stained now. He found Lena in the shop repairing a fence reel. "How many bales you feeding a day?" he asked. "Depends on the strip." "How much sorghum you got left?" "Enough." "For how long?" "Why?" Wade looked toward the field. "I sold 23 cows last week." Lena put down the screwdriver. She had heard. Everyone had. "What do you need?" "I didn't come asking for charity. I didn't offer charity." He shifted his weight. "I've got 14 bred heifers I don't want to sell." "How much hay do you have?" 4 days, maybe 5 if I stretch it." "You have any unharvested sorghum?" "None." "Corn stalks?" "Grazed out." Wade looked at the fence reel. "I was wrong about your field." Lena waited. He seemed to be trying to force the next words past his teeth. "And I was wrong about you. You were hoping we'd fail." His eyes lifted. Yes, because you wanted the ground. Yes, that was a rotten thing to do. Yes. The word sat between them. Wade could have made an excuse. He did not. Lena picked up the screwdriver again, then set it back down. I have 12 acres the Mercer cows probably won't finish. Wade looked at her. The west side? Yes. The part that went down? Some of it. The feed has been tested. Your cattle would need to come in full. We'd keep roughage out, fence it tight, and move them in small strips. What would you charge? Enough to cover labor, fence, water, and the feed value. Neighbor price? Lena looked at him. Neighbor behavior gets a neighbor price. Wade almost smiled, but he knew better. What behavior do you need? You help move fence. He nodded. You follow the plan. He nodded again. You don't open a strip because you think the cattle look hungry. All right. And the next time a family around here gets hurt, you don't circle their ground like you're waiting for a buzzard to leave. Wade looked down. That's fair. No, fair would be letting you sell the heifers. He looked back at her. This is better than fair. Lena shook her head. This is practical. We have feed, you have cattle. Selling good animals at the bottom of the market helps nobody. Wade removed his cap. I'm sorry, Lena. She believed he meant it. Not because his voice sounded sad. Because he showed up the next morning before daylight carrying fence posts. Wade's heifers entered the western field 3 days later. The winter did not become easy after that. The cold continued. A water line split near the holding pen. One cow developed pneumonia. Roy slipped on the back steps and frightened everyone more than he was willing to admit. But the farm kept moving. By early March, green began to show along the protected side of the pasture. The Mercer haystack still held 11 bales. Without the sorghum, Lena calculated they would have needed more than 60 additional bales. The money they did not spend covered the winter loan payment. It also paid a portion of Roy's hospital balance. They kept every cow. Wade kept his 14 heifers. And when the spring sale came, those heifers were worth far more than they would have brought during the January sell-off. Word traveled. At first, people asked Roy about the sorghum. Roy pointed them toward Lena. Then they asked Lena whether she had invented the system. She always gave the same answer. No, I found it. In April, 3 farmers came to the Mercer kitchen carrying notebooks of their own. Lena showed them Mabel's records. She showed them the lab reports. She showed them where the ice had taken down the fence. She did not leave that part out. She explained that the first version of her plan had failed. The field had not saved them because Lena had been right about everything. It saved them because she had been willing to admit exactly where she was wrong. The group walked the field that afternoon. Only broken stalks remained. Wade stood near the west boundary and pointed to the area where his heifers had grazed. That section kept me from selling animals I'd spent 3 years building, he said. One farmer looked at Lena. So you're planting the whole place to sorghum again? No. He seemed surprised. Why not? Because one good result doesn't mean one crop belongs everywhere. Roy smiled from behind her. That sounded like something he would have said. Lena continued. We'll plant sorghum where it fits. We'll keep pasture where pasture fits. And next time we use standing feed, the emergency fence goes up before the weather turns. The farmers wrote that down. By the next winter, 4 fields in the county were left standing on purpose. Not because grain harvest had stopped making sense. Not because everyone suddenly believed the old ways were better. They did it because hay was still expensive, drought had not disappeared, and a forgotten tool had returned to the toolbox. Each farmer managed it differently. Each tested the crop. Each talked with people who understood the risks. Each learned from the Mercer fence failure before making one of their own. Mabel's notebook remained in the kitchen, beside the weather radio. Lena added new pages. She wrote down the lab numbers, the storm dates, the size of each grazing strip, and the amount of hay saved. She wrote about the broken wire. She wrote about the red cow with baling wire caught in her mouth. She wrote about the 6 days of sub-zero cold that froze the western ground hard enough to make the damaged field usable. And beneath Mabel's sentence, "Don't pay twice for the same mouthful," Lena added one of her own. "Don't confuse a damaged plan with a dead one." Roy read it one morning. He picked up a pen and wrote beneath her line, "But don't fall in love with a plan that needs to die." Lena found it later and laughed. She left it there, because that was the part people often missed when they told the story. They said Lena had stood against her father. They said she had proved the neighbors wrong. They said she trusted old knowledge when everyone else wanted the field harvested. All of that was true, but it was not the whole truth. Lena did not save the farm by refusing to change. She saved it by knowing what not to abandon and what had to be rebuilt. She kept the idea. She changed the fence. She kept the cattle. She changed the size of the strips. She trusted her grandmother's records. She still called the extension office, the laboratory, and the veterinarian. She listened to the past without pretending the past had all the answers. And Roy changed too. He stopped treating help like proof that he had become useless. He taught Lena how to hear a dry bearing before it burned out. He showed her which low spots would hold water after a 2-inch rain. He let her make decisions. Some of them were right, some were not. But they became their decisions. Years later, people still remembered the winter the sorghum stayed standing. They remembered the red field beneath the ice. They remembered cattle feeding while hay trucks sat behind closed highways. They remembered Wade Kessler moving fence before daylight. Most of all, they remembered that the crop everyone thought Lena had failed to harvest became the feed that carried 2 herds through the coldest part of winter. But Lena remembered something smaller. She remembered the night in the North Barn office when she believed she had ruined everything. She remembered pulling apart 2 pages that had been stuck together for decades. She remembered one penciled sentence. "After a wreck, count what remains before burying it." That sentence had not promised success. It had not told her to keep going no matter what. It had only told her to look again. Sometimes that is the difference between stubbornness and courage. Stubbornness says nothing has changed. Courage looks directly at what changed, counts the damage, and decides what is still worth saving. Maybe you are standing in front of something like that right now. Maybe everyone around you sees a field that should have been cut weeks ago. Maybe they see wasted time, a bad decision, or a plan that no longer looks the way it did when you started. They might be right about part of it. The fence may be down. The storm may have done real damage. You may have made mistakes nobody else made for you. But before you bury the whole thing, count what remains. Find out what is actually lost. Find out what can still be used. Keep the part that is true. Change the part that failed. And never be too proud to test what you believe before asking other people to depend on it. If you have ever held on to an idea everyone else had already written off, tell us what happened. Did you prove them wrong? Did the plan change? Or did you discover that the real lesson was knowing when to let part of it go? And if someone once left you a piece of knowledge that made sense only years later, tell us about that person too. Because some lessons arrive as advice. Others wait quietly in a drawer, beneath old maintenance records, until the winter comes that finally explains them. Share this story with someone carrying more responsibility than people realize. Someone trying to protect a family, a farm, a business, or a future while everyone else stands at the fence offering opinions. And whatever field is standing in front of you tonight, may you have the patience to study it, the humility to test it, and the nerve to look one more time before deciding there is nothing left to save.